Right, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, to the 2018 S O Davies Memorial Lecture. As you can see, we were not expecting this many people. I think we sold about 12 or 20 tickets.
There's more than you pay at the door.
But thank you, Mary, for coming down. This is the first lady speaker that we've had in...
Woman, not a lady. I'm not.
You're not a lady, are you?
Yeah.
Woman speaker that we've had in, I don't know, something like 10 years of doing the S O Davies.
Well, from the 1980s up.
Yeah, so thank you very much for coming. And I think the best thing is if I hand over straight to you, is it?
All right.
Right, oh, thank you.
Right. The correct title of what I'm going to talk about is not a very happy story, this. Basically, what I want to talk about, the correct title should be Racism, Imperialism and the British Labour Movement. And I think what I'm going to say is, some of it shocked me actually when I researched it. I want to thank you very much for inviting me and to say that I'm very honoured to give this lecture and memorial to S O Davies, who I know, and largely because Rob's provided me with a lot of information. I know that S O Davies was a socialist, but he was also an anti-imperialist. So I think it's befitting, really, that this lecture is about imperialism and racism. Trade unions were, as we know, very strong in Britain, really from the beginning of the 19th century onwards. From the beginning of the 19th century to 1850, it was a very revolutionary movement, and we're here in Merthyr, and you've all, obviously, all of you know about the Merthyr Rising. But that was a period of very militant trade unionism, which then collapsed a little bit from the 1850s to roughly the 1880s, when unions became much narrower, just for skilled workers and, of course, only for men. In the 1880s, which is when I want to roughly start, though it might sound a long time, well, it was a long time ago, trade unionism revived. And it revived in a much broader way. Unions were formed for skilled and semi-skilled workers, largely because of socialist influence within the trade union movement. People like Eleanor Marx, for example, and Tom Mann, who I'm sure you all heard of. But although there was a socialist revival in the 1880s, this socialist revival was caught on the tidal wave of British imperialism. This was the period when Britain had had an empire for a long, long time, but this was the period and the last quarter of the 19th century where the five big European powers, but particularly France, Britain and Germany, expanded massively and took territories in all parts of the world, so that by 1914, when the First World War broke out, part of the reason for that war was precisely because the whole world had been divided up amongst the great powers, and the only resolution for it was for it to all be redivided, which is essentially why the First World War broke out. But I just want people to think about what it meant for Britain then to have such a huge such a huge empire. Basically, the only way that it could be really sold to people, because after all it was workers who had to fight and die for the empire. They were the ones that went and did all the business of conquering the so-called natives. The only way that could really work is if people, or white people in this country, believed that they were superior to black people. Hence you have racism becoming endemic. It wasn't as though racism was suddenly invented. Obviously racism underpinned slavery. Racism was there for a long, long time. But by this time, by the last quarter of the 19th century, certainly the last 20 years of the 19th century, there was now education had become free and compulsory by 1890. And that meant that there was the growth of a popular press. In other words, and schooling and all the rest of it. So what I'm really saying is that it was very important for ideas to be spread through the media, through everything that people could read, in order that, as you know, the ideological apparatus of the state is there to preserve the ruling ideas in any society. And that becomes much more important when people can read. And it becomes particularly important actually at this time when empire hysteria was absolutely at its height. Victoria had her Diamond Jubilee, Queen Victoria. And so the whole ideology of empire, which was founded on racism, was extremely important to have that as an ideology, to have some notion, somehow or other, that we were superior to those who we conquered. And those who we conquered were people who had darker colour skins. And so that's the point I want to make, basically, is that although there was a socialist revival, that socialist revival was caught on the tidal wave of British imperialism and its supporting ideology, which was racism. So that actually did have an impact on some of the socialist groups that were formed. And I'm making this as a big point because if it had an impact within the most advanced sections of the labour movement, then you can imagine that it had an impact in those not so advanced sections of the labour movement, people who already had right-wing ideas. So even if socialists were thinking in that way, which in fact they did, then basically, if you look at some of the groups that were formed, the Fabian Society was certainly pro-empire and pretty racist. Fabianism and the Empire was drafted by Bernard Shaw, published in 1900, and it could have been written by Cecil Rhodes or Joseph Chamberlain. It was racist and it was pro-imperialist. But even, basically, the line was that the profits of the empire can finance social reform. So you've got what was a form of social imperialism, saying, well, the empire's good for all of us because the profits that we make can help us have better lives in this country. And that penetrated quite deeply, this whole notion of the national interest, which some socialists, you might not consider Fabian socialists, but nevertheless they pretended they were. Basically, people like H.G. Wells and Shaw were white supremacists. This was the period when eugenics was the order of the day, when somehow or other it was thought that only the fittest survive. It was a version of Darwinism which was applied to human beings, was pretty nasty, actually. So this wasn't just the Fabians. The attitude of the mainstream of the British labour movement, for example, the TUC, was certainly pro-imperialist. It wasn't aggressively, but they were silent on the empire. But the Marxist left, you might say, well, surely they were better. Well, the only example we have of a Marxist left in this period, this is the 1880s, is the Social Democratic Federation. And that was led by H.M. Heinemann, who might like to have called himself a Marxist, but he certainly wasn't. In fact, he had more arguments with Marx and Engels than they had with almost anybody else. And he was pretty dreadful, actually. When the Boer War broke out in 1900, he basically he said that the pro-Boer sentiment was based on this is Heinemann's view, was this lack of round capitalists who he referred to as financial Jews. What I'm basically saying is that the labour movement, even the most progressive section of it, were deeply imbued with this racist prejudices. In fact, I would say that it's only in our era, in the 21st century, that some of those racist prejudices have been stripped away. They've been recognised and stripped away. But I'm afraid racism ran very, very deep, even within our movement. And it has to be recognised in order for it to be eradicated, because any division of the working class benefits those who rule us. And that the most easy divisions to make on the basis of skin colour and your sex. So women and by the way, they weren't much better on women at that time, but that's another story. And just because I'm a woman, I'm very glad that, I'm not glad I'm the first woman actually, but I'm definitely not speaking just about women. But women come into this category at all because they were completely excluded from the labour movement in these years. It's really only in our time that we've understood that things like racism and sexism actually exist as ideologies, and therefore, and we can understand them as divisive ideologies, which basically do divide workers. So, what I'm saying therefore is that although the labour movement itself wasn't absolutely hot on, understanding the empire or not particularly, I mean, really until the 1920s, the labour movement's attitude to the empire, I suppose you could say, was supportive but not proactive. But after the 1920s, things changed. So that background for me is quite important to understand the massive change that did come about during the interwar period, well, basically between the two wars. So after the First World War, the Versailles settlement divided German colonies. This is what I'm saying about the First World War was really fought in order to divide the colonial empires up. And mainly because Germany was defeated, that meant that France and Britain then had even more to get because they could get all the German colonies divided up between them, and they took a ruler into Africa and divided it up in straight lines. And it was basically a massive just cash and grab raid, really. So, but after the war, after the Versailles settlement, the British Empire territorially was at its absolute largest. Britain benefited enormously. In fact, just as an aside, we all think about that because it's the anniversary, isn't it, the centenary of the war, and it's supposed to be the Great War and all the rest of it. And really, I just think it was senseless sacrifice, but anyway, we think of the First World War as fought between the countries of the Triple Alliance on the one hand, Britain, France and Germany, and the Triple Entente on the other side. Two big sort of coalitions competing against each other. But the fact is it wasn't really like that. Britain only at the very last minute decided which side she was going to be on. Could have been with Germany. Basically, it was all about who was going to get what. So the fact that Britain, France and Russia, sorry, I did say Britain, France and Germany, didn't I? Oh God. Britain, France and Russia with the Triple Entente, the Triple Alliance, and the other lot with the Triple Entente. So the fact that Britain then, you could see exactly what was happening in 1916. In 1916, Britain and France got together, this was 2 years before the end of the war, and drew up a thing called the Sykes-Picot Agreement. And that Sykes-Picot Agreement divided the German colonies between them. That's what they were fighting for. They wanted Germany to be... So, in fact, if you look at in the Middle East, again, Iraq went here, Palestine went there, it was wherever the Germans... Anyway, so that's why I'm saying it's all about colonies. So the interwar period basically meant that the British Empire was at its very largest. And what you witness in the interwar period was the triumph of an already well-established imperial and racist ideology. So this is when the TUC then really picked the whole thing up and began to show a great interest in colonial issues. That didn't mean they were more enlightened, not at all. Interest in the colonies was motivated within the mainstream British labour movement by two concerns. Firstly, the fear that the British Empire might be lost due to the rise of national liberation movements in many of the so-called colonies, and that was happening, of course. The African National Congress had been formed in 1900, but many of the others in the Indian Congress had already been formed, so there was a threat that the empire would be dismembered. So that's reason one why they suddenly got interested. But secondly, the main thing is the fear of Bolshevism. The Russian Revolution occurred in 1917. The Comintern, the Communist International, had been formed, and the Comintern, right from its inception, was very deeply involved in the anti-imperialist struggle. And basically, the right wing, or in fact, those who supported the status quo, were absolutely determined that there should not be the spread of Bolshevism in the colonial world because, as we shall see, their fears weren't without foundation, because in 1920, the Second Comintern Congress conducted an in-depth discussion on the national and colonial question. And in that same year, under the auspices of the Comintern, the first National Congress of the Peoples of the East was held. And that term East was not used in a geographical sense. Basically, it was the generic term for non-white colonised peoples. So that the Comintern was strongly anti-imperialist, concentrated in particular its invective against British imperialism, against which Zinoviev called the delegates to mount a holy war, above all against English imperialism. So you can see why people were trembling, including the leadership of the British Labour movement, because they were not anti-imperialist. And if you take the argument that somehow the empire benefits us, then we should try and keep it. So, basically, in the light of this, it was certainly necessary, firstly, for the Labour Party, especially because it was a party of government in 1924, albeit a minority government, which only lasted a little while, but nevertheless, they had to have policy on colonial issues. And so they began to draw up policy. This is why I'm saying it's this period where you see actually a much more active interest in colonial issues and in maintaining the colonies. So in 1918, the Labour Party, of course it published its manifesto, as we know, but it also published Labour and the New Social Order, written by Sidney Webb. And it said in it that the empire was of a special concern due to Britain's responsibility for, and I quote, non-adult races. Non-adult races, meaning people who are colonised, who are a bit like monkeys, and they don't know how to look after themselves, because this is the whole civilising mission of the empire. We gave civilization to Africa and to India, and people believed it. So this is very much the whole white man's burden theme. Kipling, as you know, that was his theme. So what the Labour and the New Labour Party policy called for was greater democracy in the empire, but it didn't, especially where there was a demand for independence, but it didn't advocate the abandonment of the empire. Rather, it wanted to strengthen links with the empire through what they called a Britannic alliance. So Labour then this Britannic alliance began to develop this colonial policy, and it set up its own Imperial Affairs subcommittee, but later called Imperial Advisory Committee. Its secretary was Leonard Woolf. This basically recognised that there was an anti-British feeling in the colonies. How could we stop it from becoming too communistic, as they would put it? It had to be recognised, and in another publication called The Colonial Empire, the Labour Party recognised that independence might come, but they made a distinction, and this is very important, this distinction continued to be made between India and the rest. India, Southeast Asia and the rest. Basically, India was written off as a colony by the Labour Party because they recognised that the independence movement was so strong and that independence movement had strong communist influence. They didn't think they could hold, this is the Labour Party, didn't think it could hold on to India. The British government did, but the Labour Party didn't. But it was hoped, they hoped, and this was very well expressed in this publication called The Colonial Empire, that independence could be delayed, or at least that there should be a strong British influence in mapping out what kind of society India should be after independence. So, if possible, what they wanted was the British constitutional model to prevail. But this didn't apply to other colonies. The Caribbean was viewed by Labour as a very promising area for imperialism because they thought that the trade union movement was stirring, but that communist influence was weak. The line on Africa was very more fully expressed in a later pamphlet, and it took the traditional racist line that Britain's African colonies were inhabited, quote, by backward peoples of primitive culture, and their economic and political system is so backward that they're not yet able to stand by themselves. So we're doing them a big favour by staying there. And that was the Labour Party attitude, basically. Again, white man's burden thing. We're not doing it because we want to, we're doing it to help them. Never mind about the super profits that are yielded from the triple exploitation of colonial labour. In fact, such gross exploitation it hardly bears thinking about. So what about the TUC? How did the TUC shape up? Well, it was not until the 1930s that the TUC began to develop its own colonial policy, and of course it was greatly influenced by the Labour Party because of these links. The TUC established a new committee, the Colonial Advisory Committee, and it still actually exists in a different form even today. The Colonial Advisory Committee was formed in 1937. Its secretary was a man called Chemist, with a K, Chemist. And he basically he said that the work of this committee was greatly facilitated by the courtesy of the Colonial Office. In other words, the TUC and the government were very closely linked. Actually, some people do say that they still are, certainly in foreign policy terms. So basically the General Council, the committee's work was defined by the General Council as looking at investigating into the conditions of the principal races of the colonial empire to see how far the TUC could contribute towards raising their standard of life and generally improving their conditions. So, well, that sounds okay. Best means of remedying grievances. But this was the key point about the TUC. They said that its role would be to extend trade unionism amongst native workers, having regard to local conditions, or, whereas in Africa, trade unionism is still largely unrealisable, to safeguard the interests of indigenous workers pending their transition to industrial organisation by the appointment of labour commissioners. Now, the TUC's Colonial Advisory Committee therefore dealt with all British colonies excluding India. And arising from this first statement about extending trade unionism, in 1938, the TUC formulated its demand for the appointment of labour advisors to be sent to the colonies in order to assist the development of trade unionism on the British model. That was the key thing, on the British model. So in 1938, Walter Citrine, who was the TUC General Secretary, went as a member of the West Indies Royal Commission, the Moyne Commission it was called, to the Caribbean because there were labour disturbances in Trinidad, and there had to be an inquiry into that. So this was a government commission that went, but it included Citrine, which again shows that there was a closeness between the government and the TUC. What then happened was that this link between the Colonial Office of the government and the TUC really then began to have enormous force, actually. In 1940, the Labour Party entered into a coalition government, and that meant the TUC influence on official thinking on Labour matters was much greater, and there was a mutual interaction between the TUC and the government. So the 1940 Colonial Development and Welfare Act encouraged the spread of trade unionism in the colonies by legalising trade unions and encouraging their development. And the second thing was that it supported officially now, this was in the Act, colonial trade union advisors to ensure that such unions were established on the right lines, i.e. on the British model. So TUC policy therefore had come of age. Now it was official that they could send these trade union advisors to the colonies to get trade unionism, yes, established, but on the right lines. In other words, free of communist influence. This kind of chimes with the fact that in this period there was a change in attitude in the West to race and empire, which changed from what you could call racial confidence, as in the 19th and early 20th centuries, in the heyday of imperialism, to what I think could be called racial fear in the period of decolonisation. Don't forget that some colonies were becoming independent, getting their independence. World War II probably was the catalyst for change, because decolonisation was a factor, but also within Britain and America, there was a racial fear, because more black people were, well, obviously they would exist in America, but the Windrush generation and so on led to racist attitudes being developed actually within this country, not just towards the colonies. So race was kind of identified as a potentially destabilising element in the international order, and also in the domestic order for countries that had, well, like America had large black populations, but also there was the fear, the Cold War fear, and obviously after the Second World War, the Cold War fears of the Soviet Union and its influence on the colonies, and the fact that independence might then lead to Soviet satellites being established in what once were British and French colonies. So anti-communism was part of it, racial fear was another part of it, and in a period where it was clear that some form of colonial independence was at worst inevitable, or at least could be deferred, the most important issue was to ensure that emergent governments remained friendly to Western capitalism. That was the key thing. And the TUC was firmly committed to this position, especially after 1945, when Labour was in power. First majority Labour government, as we know. The TUC anyway was very committed to an anti-communist line in this period. Citrine was an arch anti-communist. He had always said that communists basically support revolutionary dictators and try to corrupt the unions they profess to support. And in 1948, the General Council of the TUC urged all affiliates, quote, to counteract any manifestation of communist influence within their trade unions. It published, the TUC this is, published 3 pamphlets on this subject. 2 of these were written in 1949, called Defend Democracy and the Tactics of Disruption, and then the TUC and Communism. Communists were banned from holding office, banned from trades councils. There was an anti-communist witch hunt. So the TUC didn't need to be convinced itself that communism was dreadful. They already thought that. So in that sense, they were very aligned with this kind of colonial line that you have to establish trade unions on the British model, free of communist influence. And this also mirrored the split within the international trade union movement, because the World Federation of Trade Unions was established after the Second World War, but the TUC argued that it was the main vehicle for communist infiltration internationally. So the TUC disaffiliated from it in 1949 in favour of the American-backed International Confederation of Free Trade Unions. So a big split, again, Cold War split. And this had an impact, as I say, on colonial policy and race policy, really. So the development of trade unions in the colonies had therefore an overt anti-communist purpose. Well, you could say then, how can you explain the fact that this wonderful Labour government in 1945, which was so progressive domestically, could still have such a, well, what sort of policy did it have internationally? Well, actually, its colonial policy was not radical, and its foreign policy wasn't radical. I'm really sorry to say that, but I'm sure it will be improved as if we get another Labour government, which I hope we will. But basically, the achievement of Indian independence in 1947 is often cited as representing the triumph of anti-colonial policy, but of course the Indians won their independence. They weren't given it. No country was given independence, they won it. And it's like nothing we've got has ever come just through giving it to us, it's come through struggle. So Labour wasn't anti-imperialist. Apart from India, only Ceylon, one or two others won their independence during the life of the Labour government. One was the operative word. So Labour did as much as it could to preserve the empire. And if it couldn't, it concentrated all its effort on ensuring that the post-colonial world was still safe for capitalism. The post-colonial world, the neo-colonialist world, which meant that all those firms that had invested heavily in the colonies to rip them of their natural wealth and their natural assets could still be there, left free, as they still are, to exploit them again. So left safe for, even after independence, to ensure that the interest of the capitalist class was still preserved. And basically, the policy of the TUC and the Labour Party was to head off independence movements in the colonies by granting reform. And the TUC, the key feature of this reform programme was to permit the development of non-militant trade unions. I stress this point because, as you'll see, that's exactly what the TUC did. So this, together with labour legislation, was regarded as both vital in its own right, but as a measure of social control, which, especially during the Cold War years, was pretty regarded as a vital means of safeguarding British colonial investments. The agency for delivering this strategy was actually the TUC itself, and the legalisation of colonial trade unions, but under control mechanism. The mechanism itself was twofold. One is to legalise trade unions, that was important, but the other one was three things: legalisation, compulsory registration of colonial trade unions, the powers of the registrars could be used to root out troublemakers, and that's exactly what happened. To quote, the existing powers to refuse or cancel registration might not enable the registrars to prevent irresponsible individuals or groups from forming trade unions for political or non-industrial objects. And I put a not in, but that's what it precisely was used to do. But the third thing, and probably the most important mechanism for influencing the development of orderly industrial relations on the British model, was the appointment of trade union advisors sent from the British TUC with the full support of the Colonial Office, in fact paid for by the Colonial Office. So these colonial trade union advisors were TUC appointments, funded by the Foreign Office. And that, I think, is quite important. The first two, and this is kind of quite new stuff that I've found, and it's quite shocking, actually, in a way, because I've read all their reports, and they really make awful reading. The first two colonial advisors were actually appointed in 1941, one for Trinidad, because there were trouble there, and one for the Gold Coast. Many more had been planned, but the war intervened, so it really souped up after the war. By the 50s, they operated, these colonial trade union advisors operated in 15 colonies with a total staff of about 500. And basically, therefore, the link between the government, as I said, and the trade union was central to it. The Colonial Office itself said that, this is the Colonial Office, it is clear that the British TUC is capable of exercising an important and formative influence on the trade unions of the colonies. Well, there you have it. It's what the government's saying. And this is now a Tory government we're talking about in the 50s. And this, it was 1950. And the newly established International Confederation, well, it wasn't newly established, but the International Confederation of Free Trade Unions was regarded warmly by the Colonial Office because it would play, quote, a more direct part in combating communism than the TUC. Now, what they then did in the colonies with these trade union advisors was they produced handbooks and guides. They were issued widely in each colony they were part of to show the colonials the error of their ways and to suggest alternatives. I'll quote from the guiding for Kenya called What is a Trade Union? And it said, this is quite awful really, trade unions are formed so that strikes can be avoided. Trade unions try to make sure that workers and employers understand one another. The value of a worker to his employer depends on the kind of work he does. Good, hard work is of more value than bad, lazy work. Now, that's the advice to an emerging trade union movement in Kenya, which is actually a very militant trade union movement. But so, the Gold Coast one, Your Trade Union, it's called, took a similar line. Trade unions are really formed to avoid strikes. Experience shows that strikes are not of any benefit either to the worker or the employer. Trade unions are formed to try to make sure that workers and employers understand one another. Well, this is tame trade unionism. This is exactly what the British government wanted. But of course, they were foiled in lots of cases, like Burma, for example. The TUC reported that they were really concerned about Burma because of the present unsatisfactory state, the mushroom growth of trade unions in Burma, basically under communist influence. Well, that was no good. So there were loads of reports. I could repeat many of them. Of this, for example, Malaya, the colonial labour advisor, was clear that his aim was to set up tame trade unions free of communist influence, but he recognised that he failed because in 1948, anyway, the British went to war with Malaya, with the Malayan Federation, because they were concerned that there was communist influence, so they had to smash it, literally. So I could quote from almost any colony you like, where a colonial TUC, colonial labour advisor was sent. They established trade unions on that basis and told the workers, who were obviously too stupid to work it out for themselves, that they shouldn't strike because it was not a very good thing to do. Now, basically, really things did change though in the 1950s, the so-called wind of change. You remember Macmillan talking about the wind of change? Basically, what was happening in the 50s was that colonial independence movements were really doing pretty well. So what could happen to these colonial labour advisors? There was, from 1951 until 1964, there was a period of uninterrupted Tory rule. And the Colonial Office that did then begin to pursue a different line on trade union matters for two major reasons. One, as I said, Matt Billen had a realistic approach to colonial independence. Basically, he reckoned that you couldn't do anything about it, it was happening. But what the line was in this wind of change is that if the British Empire is at an end, it could be replaced with a much smaller British Commonwealth. And the TUC still has got a Commonwealth TUC, by the way. But also what the Tories recognised was that the strongest power in the world now was America. And basically, they had the worldwide hegemony. This change was clearly spelled out in the conclusion of a report of the East African Royal Commission in 1955. It said, the attempt to encourage the growth of trade unions on the British model is likely for some time to come to represent an expenditure of effort which might be employed more effectively in other directions. In other words, the Colonial Office was no longer going to fund this TUC initiative. So actually it was a Tory government that said, after the TUC, we're not going to sponsor these labour advisors anymore. America's much more stronger, the ICFTU is more stronger, and anyway, colonial independence is happening. The TUC said, oh, the TUC can carry on this on its own if they wanted to, but the TUC actually didn't like the change in the government policy. The TUC said in 1956, believing that the British trade union movement has a continuing contribution to make in assisting trade unions abroad, especially in the developing areas of the Commonwealth, Congress invites the General Council to consider creating within the TUC a Commonwealth Secretariat. So in other words, they also withdrew, but they didn't want to withdraw completely. So basically, the TUC noted very sadly that somehow or other that all the work they'd done in trying to tame trade unions that couldn't be continued, but it had succeeded in certain areas, so they were quite pleased with that. But this initiative then tapered off, and what remained of it was the TUC Colonial Advisory thing. So just, have I gone on too long?
No, you're right, it's great.
Okay, well, just some conclusions then. You might think that this seems just like a very kind of academic-y sort of off-the-wall thing, but I think it's important because we can never really fully understand, I think, what has kept our movement back unless we understand what went wrong. And this is something I think that went wrong very badly. Not only very badly for the colonists, but also for this country as well, because it kept workers apart, and particularly on the basis of their skin colour, and encouraged the sort of a racial superiority attitude, which really has got no place if we're trying to win a socialist world. I mean, absolutely got no place. And, you know, we're celebrating this year the 150th anniversary of the TUC, but there's warts and all, and I think the warts do have to be exposed because we can never get a better movement unless we actually look at what was wrong and how, therefore, we should try to change it. So certain general points are clear, I think, from this. TUC colonial policy was a late development, but it was never anti-imperialist. So whatever the rhetoric about the desire for colonial self-government, very little was forthcoming during the period, even of the, well, certainly of the third Labour government. And that's because implicit racist thinking, overtly nurtured in the previous 70 or so years, continued to influence the Labour movement's views. The use of trade unionism to discourage the development of pro-communist political movement, which might take advantage of the very delayed voting rights in most colonies after 1945, was partially successful. Where it didn't deliver compliance, the movement was crushed, as in the Malayan Federation, and in Kenya, by the way. But for the most part, British-inspired trade unionism, working with the Colonial Office and through the trade union labour advisors, began to take hold, supplemented by a major programme of government-funded trade union education, which I'm going to say a word about in a minute, and by the resource of the ICFTU. The colonial world was left safe for neo-colonialism, and that's the extent to which the policy was successful. You grant reforms, but you never give them the whole thing. Grant reforms, give them crumbs, let them have voting rights, let them form trade unions, a few little reforms, and that will make it safe. Safe for what? Safe for capital. That's the key question, always. And actually, Macmillan was stupid and sensible at the same time. He saw what was coming. He saw they were going to get independence. But the key thing is, what sort of independence? And if you look at India now, you can see that the independence, we've now got this Modi government who's absolutely Trump supporter and pro-capitalist. That, you know, it was all planned, it's not all planned out, but I mean, the fact is the movement has to be stronger in order to prevent this sort of thing happening. Just one word on the use of ideas. Probably everybody here has been at some point or another on had some form of trade union education. The TUC used to run courses and Ruskin ran courses and all the rest of it. The interesting thing about the courses that were run in the colonies for these aspirant trade unionists, so they'd become trade unionists on the British model, was the kind of trade union education they got, and in particular the kind of history they got. And I want to end up on this word about history, because our history is important, and unless we understand it properly, nothing's going to change. It is our history, but it's been interpreted for us, and I'll tell you how it's interpreted for poor, benighted people in the colonies. The TUC started its history lesson in 1850. Why did they do that? Because the previous period was revolutionary, and they weren't going to teach them about the Merthyr Rising or about Chartism or about the Tolpuddle Martyrs or about anything like that. So they started with new model unions, unions that had their slogan, okay, an injury to one is an injury to all, but the strike is a double-edged weapon. Be careful. And you know, the slogan of the engineers was defence, not defiance. And that form of trade unionism, which basically led to the formation of the TUC itself in 1868, the junta, it was those new model unions, skilled workers that formed the TUC, that was the history that the people in the colonial world had to learn about, because that was the model. And the model was then of having one trade union confederation, which is a good thing, but that trade union confederation was not a campaigning one, as it isn't here, unfortunately. So our history is really quite important. That's one of the reasons why I wanted to actually lift the lid on this history, because we can only combat false ideas when we know where they came from and where they started and why they started. And none of this was in our interest. None of this really was in the interest of any British worker, and certainly no colonial worker's interest at all. But it happened. So I think they did what they said they'd do. They worked together with the government, and we've got to stop them ever doing that again. That's the only thing I learned from this. And the other thing I learned is what is the divisive ideologies that divide us and basically try to ensure that we know our place. And those divisive ideologies are the simplest way of dividing people on the basis of race and sex. And that's what we have to combat. And we have made some progress, but it's not over yet. Not by any means. So I'm glad I'm the first woman to speak here, but I hope I'm not the last. Thank you very much.